information is problematic or flawed for there to be a bad outcome is obviously very high.
Now I want to talk for a minute about scientific reliability in the field of psychology generally. Are you familiar with the concept of inter-rater reliability?
Yes.
Could you explain to the court what that term means?
Sure. Inter-rater reliability is essentially a statistical concept that you can measure with numbers and develop or provide information about the degree to which different examiners essentially converge on their opinions about some topic, whether it is the presence or absence of a diagnosis, for example, or a prediction that is made about future behavior. And inter-rater reliability is something that is central to doing good practice in the field in relation to being able to claim that if I go into court and provide a diagnosis, there should be evidence in general that that diagnosis is not a function of just my idiosyncratic opinions or beliefs. And the fields of various fields within mental health, forensic psychiatry and psychology and other areas are concerned about inter-rater reliability because there is a long history of diagnoses and opinions provided by mental health professionals not being very reliable across different examiners.
And so does the fact that poor inter-rater reliability exists in the field of psychology and psychiatry mean that it's impossible to assess the quality of a clinician's methodology?
Objection, lady.
Sustained.
Just a moment, Your Honor.
Mm-hmm.
So what does poor inter-rater reliability mean in terms of assessing the methodology of a clinician?
Well, if opinions offered in psychological evaluations, whether they're in court or elsewhere, if those are fundamentally not very stable across different experts, then it calls into question the scientific basis of it and its usefulness in any kind of real world context. I mean, a foundational principle of science is that we can measure things reliably. And if the things that we are assessing or measuring are not very reliable, then it's hard to argue that those things have any intrinsic sort of usefulness or merit. If my opinion of whether somebody suffers from schizophrenia or not is completely untethered from the opinion that other mental health professionals might have, then there's a big problem with my opinion in terms of whether anybody should give it any weight or credence.
And so in assessing a clinician's methodology and coming to a particular conclusion, how do you differentiate between a difference in reasonable conclusions and an actually flawed methodology?
Well, so we actually study inter-rater reliability, and you can evaluate whether methods are stable across different experts who are applying them. And there are numerous studies looking at the stability or reliability of psychiatric diagnoses, opinions offered in court about things such as future dangerousness and violence risk. So it is something that has been scientifically studied, and there is evidence that certain approaches and certain methodologies are more reliable than others on average.
So then let's redirect a bit then to your actual considerations of Dr. Rambula's testimony and methodology in this case.
Sure.
Do you recall Dr. Rambula's testimony?
Yes.
Was there a diagnosis that Dr. Rambula used in his testimony in evaluating Mr. McKane?
Yes.
What was that diagnosis?
It was antisocial personality disorder.
just so that we don't have to say antisocial personality disorder 45 times over the next couple hours, can that also be referred to as ASPD?
Yes.
Do you have concerns with the manner in which Dr. Arambula came to the diagnosis of ASPD?
Objection stated.
Sustained.
All right, so I guess I want to discuss the manner in which Dr. Arambula came to that diagnosis. Do you recall in Dr. Arambula's testimony whether or not he engaged in a clinical interview of Mr. McKane?
He stated during direct examination that he did not interview Mr. McKane.
And speaking scientifically, is that an issue?
It is a concern in regards to the thoroughness and the strength of the methodology to reach conclusions about both personality disorders, the presence or absence of those, as well as issues of making statements or claims about whether somebody is or isn't a future danger in terms of residing in, if serving out a life sentence.
What does a clinical interview do for a clinician in assessing for a particular diagnosis?
Well, it's standard practice that if you are doing an evaluation of someone's mental health or searching for the presence of mental illness, or if you plan to make statements about someone's likely future behavior, that you would want to incorporate information from that person to provide some context to those opinions that you're developing.
Is reviewing, say, a police interrogation of an individual or a news interview of an individual substitute for a clinical interview of that person?
No.
And why is it not?
Well, the examiner is trained in how to search for and assess the presence of mental health issues or psychiatric symptoms, and you need to have control over what you are asking in order to be able to address those things. The information that would get covered in other interviews conducted by other people, might address some things that are relevant. I'm not saying that information wouldn't be potentially useful, but it is completely out of your control what questions get asked, and to me it's self-evident that an interview gives you the opportunity to get information that is not that's not addressed in other sorts of areas, even if you have a lot of collateral or file evidence.
Speaking ethically, is there a concern with a clinician providing a diagnosis without having first conducted a clinical interview of that individual?
Well, now I'm using acronyms, sorry. The American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, their ethics guidelines and some associated documentation they provide online about a question and answer series about what is and is not appropriate behavior for forensic psychiatrists actually talks specifically about the need to conduct interviews in the course of evaluating somebody, especially in the context of capital proceedings.
Do the ethical guidelines have anything to say about how a mental health expert should testify about their diagnosis if they are unable to conduct such an interview?
Objection
Yes.
leading. Call for hearsay.
I'll sustain the leading.
Can you speak at all to ethical guidelines regarding testimony after failing to conduct a clinical interview?
Yes, the guidelines don't say you cannot testify if you do not do an interview. It is clear that they strongly support doing that as standard practice. If you are prevented from doing an interview, or if for some reason it just does not happen, and you still feel that you have useful information to provide, you are at various points in those documents, it makes clear that you are to talk about the limitations that places on the opinions that you are providing.
And in terms of, I guess, science, why do the ethical guidelines require that?
Why do they require what?
Why do they require the limitation on testimony that you just referenced?
Well, in terms of, it's again one of these issues of, do you actually have adequate information to come to the conclusions that you have, and if there are things that you do not know about someone that might be relevant to those opinions, you have a burden to disclose the limitations to the opinions that you are offering. And clearly the ethics code indicates that the lack of conducting a personal evaluation is a significant concern that should be proactively noted.
If you were in a situation where you were not able to conduct a clinical interview and had to testify about your consideration of a diagnosis, how would you qualify your testimony to a jury?
Well, first, I might not testify if I don't believe I have adequate information to answer the question that's been put before me. Then I would not provide that. I would say I cannot make that, I can't offer that opinion. I've actually had that happen in some sexually violent predator civil commitment evaluations I did years ago, where we were doing evaluations and I didn't believe we had enough information to address the question of that was being posed in those types of evaluations. So one option is to say nothing, or if not say nothing, say I do not have enough information to offer an opinion. If I feel like I have enough information that crosses some threshold to provide some information about the individual who I have not interviewed, then I would want to make clear that that limits the strength that I have in relation to, or confidence in those opinions. And I would probably talk about provisional symptoms that I believe are present in the record, but in the absence of, say, a diagnostic interview, I could not necessarily confirm that those things were definitively there. So there are lots of ways somebody can qualify what they might say. That's how I would approach it under that circumstance.
In your review of Dr. Arandula's testimony, did you see any sort of ethically appropriate qualification regarding his testimony?
Well, Dr. Arandula noted that he did not conduct an interview, and at various points in his testimony, in particular on cross-examination, he did acknowledge that there were things that he didn't know about Mr. McKane due to the lack of having conducted an interview. When he offered his summary opinion, however, about his diagnostic impressions and his perception of the answer to the future dangerousness special issue, I did not see evidence of him qualifying those opinions based on the lack of interview information.
Is that concerning to you?
Yes, I believe that would have been the appropriate thing to do.
And why is that concerning to you?
Well, for all the reasons I've stated about how the lack of that information can potentially lead jurors to have an impression that something is scientifically or professionally well established based on how the expert witness is testifying about it, without identifying the reservations of not having all of the sorts of information one would typically want to see, such as an interview. And I would add that in relation to that, a large part of the future danger testimony that Dr. Arambula provided focused to a considerable detail on his beliefs and perceptions about how Mr. McKane thought, and what he described at various points as sort of violent thinking patterns, or words to that effect. And those types of inferences in particular, I
I'm
would suggest,
objecting.
are problematic.
Sorry, object your narrative at this point.
I'll sustain it, and if either side gets up and objects, just wait for us to resolve that.
Sure.
So I want to turn now, Dr. Edens, to how Dr. Arambula applied the diagnostic criteria for ASPD. Are you familiar with the diagnostic criteria for ASPD?
Yes.
Where are those contained?
They're in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which people refer to as the DSM-5.
Does the DSM-5 require anything with regarding to ruling out other diagnoses prior to making a diagnosis of ASPD?
Yes.
What does it require?
So there are numerous hurdles, essentially, in the diagnosis of personality disorders in general. There are multiple personality disorders in the DSM-5, and ASPD is one of those. And the guidelines for making a determination about the presence or absence of personality disorders talks at length about various things that need to be considered when considering making such a diagnosis. And I can extrapolate on those if that's not narrative, but
Well,
I'm
so
happy to stop there.
Yeah, Dr. Edens, I can I'll ask a follow-up. So
Okay.
why does the DSM-5 require that certain other diagnoses be ruled out prior to making a diagnosis of ASPD?
Yeah. So the simplest way to describe it is that the diagnosis of a personality disorder is reserved for individuals who engage in chronic, pervasive, maladaptive actions, as well as have chronic, stable personality conditions that are considered to be largely unchanging. And the requirements for that are that those things have to be present over extended periods of time, and the explanatory power of essentially why someone engages in, say, maladaptive behavior, for saying, well, that's because of a personality disorder, is generally reserved for, it's almost kind of a fallback position if there are other explanations for someone's behavior or symptoms, such as other mental health conditions, then one does not immediately jump to this idea of a long-standing, stable personality pattern. So, for example, and the DSM gives this sort of as a concrete example, if criminal behavior, which can be a sign of antisocial personality disorder, tends to only occur in the course of some other mental health problem, whether it be substance abuse or schizophrenia or a bipolar disorder, then one would not diagnose a personality disorder in addition to that other disorder that is explaining why that is the explanation for where that behavior is coming from. And the DSM also indicates that the presence of, specifically with criminality, in and of itself, is not enough to diagnose somebody with an antisocial personality disorder. It has to be, because there can be multiple explanations for causes of someone to break the law. So it has to fit into this much broader pattern, and is also why it's tied to an individual specifically for ASPD having to have had a history of conduct disorder at earlier points in life as well.
Okay. In your review of Dr. Arambula's testimony, did he describe conducting such a rule-out process prior to applying a diagnosis of ASPD?
He did not discuss those terms. He did say that he saw no evidence in the records that he had reviewed of psychosis or substance abuse as explaining what he described to be Mr. McKane's actions and behaviors and personality, but there was no, he did not evaluate those characteristics himself to see whether they were present or not.
In Dr. Arambula's testimony, while he was discussing the purported history of antisocial conduct, did Dr. Arambula engage in any sort of discussion about the context of that conduct?
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow exactly.
In your review of Dr. Arambula's testimony, did it appear that he was considering the context of potentially antisocial conduct?
Well, relying on his direct testimony, he walked through, and I believe they even referred to it as a checklist at one point, of factors that were identified as either being consistent with the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And those were checked off basically during testimony as that there were things in Mr. McKane's past that appeared to be consistent with that particular criterion or symptom.
Are the criteria for an ASPD diagnosis a simple checklist?
Well, no. You have to engage in the process I was describing to consider, again, rule out diagnoses, whether the behavior is, if you're talking about criminal acts, whether that is consistent with, again, this broader pervasive pattern and tied to an underlying personality dynamic that is ostensibly sort of the cause of that kind of criminal behavior. So the simple presence of things that could be tied to the antisocial criteria doesn't mean that they are actually being met. So it's not simply checking off a list of characteristics.
In your review of Dr. Arambula's testimony, did he describe giving any weight to possible alternative explanations for the history of antisocial conduct he was referring to?
I did not see much evidence of considering alternative explanations other than that the things that were brought up were identified as being directly tied to, well, that's antisocial personality disorder. That's what you would see.
In terms of diagnostic accuracy, are there risks associated with failing to understand the context of potentially antisocial conduct?
Well, yes, the DSM itself talks about the need to consider context when evaluating the criteria for any disorder. And again, it explicitly rules out that simply engaging in criminal acts, for example, is not enough to say that somebody has antisocial personality disorder. And you have to go through and consider, again, what are other potential explanations for those symptoms that could equally explain why somebody is behaving the way that they are behaving.
Do you recall Dr. Arambula describing the ASPD diagnosis he applied to Mr. McKane as robust.
Yes.
Is robust a diagnostic term?
I don't believe it's anywhere in the DSM. I have not routinely heard people use that sort of expression. I took it to mean that he was confident that all of the symptoms of ASPD were present in this case.
Do you have any concerns with the manner in which he used the term robust?
Objection, relevance.
Judge, I think it goes to the side.
Overruled.
You can proceed.
I mean, it's under the circumstances, it's not a term I would generally use when talking about diagnostic confidence, for lack of a better word.
Does it relate at all to your opinion regarding Dr. Angela's failure to qualify his opinion?
Objection, leading.
Judge, I don't think that suggests the answer to the question.
You can rephrase it.
Are you able to apply your thoughts on his use of the term robust to your opinion regarding qualification or lack thereof of his testimony?
I would say that using a term robust conveys a great deal of confidence that this is a clear-cut situation with very little qualifications, which again, in the absence of an interview, I believe would be an appropriate thing to note as a qualification.
So I want to speak to you for a minute, Dr. Edens, about relying on collateral records and information in informing a diagnosis, okay?
Sure.
Is relying on collateral records or information a common part of forensic psychology and psychiatry?
Yes, it's the norm to incorporate information beyond simply somebody's self-report.
Does that sometimes include or involve making inferences about those records and information?
Yes.
How can a clinician try to avoid making an unreasonable inference about those records or information?
Well, I mean, obviously it depends on the quality of the information that you start with. Clinicians are constantly developing ideas to try to make sense of someone's conduct or behavior or their symptoms, and records may provide information that provide some hypothesis potentially about whether some symptom is even present or not, if you're trying to decide if a diagnosis is relevant. The general approach to evaluating information that all mental health professionals are trained in is to try to seek out information to test out whatever hypotheses that we have, and even more importantly, to be open to and consider disconfirmatory information that actually runs counter to what our initial assumptions or hypotheses are. And that's a central part of maintaining, trying as best you can to maintain a neutral and objective stance for evaluating information, is to consider and actively search for information that might prove that you're wrong about something. And we refer to that as, if you do fall prey to that, we call that confirmation bias.
So yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on confirmation bias?
Yeah, confirmation bias is a basic human tendency that we all have to seek out information generally that is consistent with what we already think about something. And that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that professionals in all sorts of settings are prone to those types of problems as well. It's just sort of a way of trying to make sense of the world. And a scientific approach to trying to make sense of what is going on is to try to, again, not just look for things that fit with what we already think, but to actively search for things that might disconfirm what we believe. And that's part of what makes something a scientific approach to, trying to understand something.
And Dr. Edens, if you were in the position of having to rely on a hypothesis about what records and information mean, how would you convey to the jury that you're relying on a hypothesis rather than actually relying on records and information that you are aware of?
If I have some inkling that something may be true based on information in a record I've been asked to review, and I haven't done an interview to find out more information about whatever that issue is, and nothing else in the record directly addresses that, so I'm left with basically something that is, you might refer to it as low-hanging fruit. It could sort of indicate something perhaps, but you don't have anything more substantial to validate that or confirm that or disconfirm that. Then I would describe it as such. There is some evidence of this, but I would treat it as something that's, might use the word provisional, but I would qualify my attitude about that. And again, I don't want to leave this out, that if it's below a level that I have any great deal of confidence in knowing what it really means, then I don't have to bring it up at all as somebody who's there to provide, an expert opinion about something.
In your review of Dr. Rambula's testimony, did you see areas in which he was making these sorts of inferential leaps about records and information not available to him?
Well, there was, and I'm relying on what was in the transcript, but there was a discussion of, I believe it was juvenile probation records, where there was some commentary about certain conditions of probation needing to be met, and that because of that, that must indicate that those conditions were put there because there was a problem in that area.
And generally speaking, Dr. Edens, if you do ultimately have to stay with an unconfirmed hypothesis, is it appropriate for a clinician to incorporate that unconfirmed hypothesis as part of their finding for a basic diagnostic criteria?
We're talking at a very abstract level at this point, so it's hard to provide a concrete kind of answer to that. But I would say again that if you have information that can be that could indicate something, but could also be interpreted in a lot of other different ways, or could mean something completely different, then I would not rely on that as a foundational part of making an argument that, say, somebody had symptoms of conduct disorder at a much earlier point in their life.
And based on your review of, and based on that portion of the transcript you referenced earlier, did it appear that Dr. Rambula was making such an inferential leap and then relying on it in that way?
It appeared to be. He did not specifically talk about, at that point, the presence of conduct disorder, but he talked about it in the context of evidence of essentially childhood behavior problems and adolescent acting out types of behaviors. And the reason that is, you know, relevant is because of, in the absence of having conduct disorder, you cannot make a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. The DSM precludes that.
And outside of that context where he's making inferences about the existence of juvenile behaviors, does Dr. Arambula state a basis for finding conduct disorder?
I don't recall that he explicitly commented about whether conduct disorder was present or not. He kind of touched on some of the symptoms of that, but I don't know that he explicitly, I do not recall reading it, that he explicitly said that Mr. McKane showed evidence of conduct disorder, you know, in his adolescence. But if he diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, that is implicit in that diagnosis, because you have to have evidence of that.
So I want to turn you now to the way that Dr. Arambula discussed ASPD as a condition. Do you recall Dr. Arambula saying in testimony that ASPD was not a mental illness?
Yes.
Do you recall how he contrasted ASPD with other major mental illnesses?
Yes.
What was that testimony, if you can recall?
It was somewhat confusing to me because there were some contradictory assertions made about what personality disorders were, and so I had some trouble following the logic that was being provided, but there was a statement that they were not mental disorders, although they are in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders. And then there was a discussion of that, you know, unlike other disorders such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that those disorders, personality disorders, were to some degree based on choices that people made, that they had choice to, you know, it appeared, you know, whether they had those characteristics or not, which was somewhat confusing. I understand the concept of choice in relation to, say, you know, criminal responsibility. People don't argue that personality disorders are evidence of somebody who is, you know, insane. You know, they have an understanding of right from wrong and things of that nature. Whereas in schizophrenia, you might have somebody who meets the legal definition of insanity. But I found that section very confusing. And despite it being described as essentially a choice, that one's personality is something that one chooses, antisocial personality disorder was explicitly described as being something that didn't change over time, and that people who are antisocial are generally going to continue to be antisocial, which I struggle to understand how that related to the whole issue of choosing to have certain personality characteristics. So I was confused by much of that discussion.
So, given your lack of confusion, how do you feel about how that information was conveyed to the jury?
Object to relevance, Your Honor.
I think it certainly goes to prejudice of the testimony.
I'm saying calls for speculation.
I do think that he has the expertise to comment on that.
Overrule.
Well, so, I mean, the concern is some of what was being stated was not consistent with what we actually know about some of the opinions that he was offering. For example, personality disorders do have a genetic component to them, as well as being environmentally determined as well. People, there's lots of research on them. They are legitimate mental disorders. The idea that one can simply choose to change one's personality so that one does have volitional control over it is, again, I think, not really supported in relation to what we know about those types of disorders. And then contrasting that with the added statement that these are things that don't change and that they're stable and somebody will always be that way, runs counter to what we know about the stability of personality diagnoses, personality disorder diagnoses, excuse me, that they can wax and wane, and that they are amenable to treatment as well. So I believe, and I don't feel like I have the expertise to say how that impacted the jury specifically, but it definitely gave them information stated from the point of view of an expert that I believe was not based on solid, sound scientific evidence.
Do you recall whether Dr. Arambula used any terms besides ASPD in describing that diagnosis?
Yes.
What terms did he use?
The specific terms were sociopath and psychopath, and he also at various points referred to it as sociopathy and psychopathy.
So, referring, I guess, do you have any concerns about the use of those terms?
I do.
What are those concerns?
So this is an area I've been conducting research on for most of my career as a scholar, and there are numerous problems with those particular labels, which are not incorporated as diagnoses in the DSM at this point. The DSM does say that those labels have previously been used to describe something similar to what is now called antisocial personality disorder. And I have numerous concerns. I will just begin with stating one, which is that they are very prejudicial labels, that if you hear someone identified as that person is a psychopath, that carries with it a considerable amount of stigma and negative assumptions about what someone is likely to be like.
Are you aware of any research regarding the prejudicial impact of using those sorts of terms on juries?
Yes. So when I first started working in capital cases where the term psychopath would come up, when asked about this, I would basically say it seems self-evident to me that a term like psychopath is something that carries with it a lot of negative baggage. But when I started looking at, well, what's the actual scientific literature on the effects of this on people's attitudes, there actually wasn't very much that had been published at that point. So in the early 2000s, my research lab, graduate students and myself and other colleagues, started conducting mock jury studies where we were actually manipulating in these studies the sort of diagnostic evidence that would get presented to these mock jurors. And so individuals would basically read the same transcript or excerpts from a capital case, and the only thing that would be different about the case would be we would change whether the defendant was described as being, in one particular study, psychopathic, having schizophrenia, or having no mental disorder at all after an evaluation was conducted. And that early study, we found clear evidence that if you describe somebody as psychopathic in this type of context, relative to, I don't think there's any diagnosis, or someone has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, jurors tend to be much more likely to say, I believe that person warrants a death sentence. And they also tend to think that those individuals are likely to be more dangerous in the future than somebody described as non-disordered or psychopathic. And some of the research that we've looked at, also they tend to ask them, we sometimes ask them, this is kind of extrajudicial questions at the end, but how evil do you think this person is? And somebody labeled as psychopathic tends to get labeled or identified as somebody who's more evil as well. So it carries a lot of negative consequences potentially for somebody who's labeled as such.
Are you aware of any research regarding the relative prejudice of that term versus the term pedophilia?
Well, so there is a study in relation to, more specifically, antisocial personality disorder, and this was not a mock jury study. This was simply some research conducted looking at community attitudes towards different types of mental disorder in the DSM. And I believe there were 40 different vignettes written to describe different DSM-related diagnoses that were presented to individuals. And they were basically asked to rate those individuals in terms of social closeness and the extent to which they would want to be around that person, or they would be concerned about that person. So it's essentially, the outcome measure was a measure of social rejection, like how much do you want to be around this person. And in that study, the pedophilia actually was the second most negatively rated diagnosis, and the negative ratings were actually slightly exceeded by that for antisocial personality disorder. They were very close. They were pretty much neck and neck in terms of, but those were seen, as these are the most sorts of individuals we want to have nothing to do with. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Are you aware of any research regarding what sorts of connections individuals make when they hear the term antisocial?
Yes, so we have done this sort of survey research, and a few other researchers have as well. And if you just ask sort of lay people in the community, we've actually collected data from people showing up for jury duty in Dallas, done a couple of studies, and if you just basically ask people, like, when you hear the word psychopath, who do you think of? The most common people that come up tend to be Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, and occasionally in some of these surveys, Hitler pops up as one of the more common individuals. So clearly, when you ask somebody who's a psychopath, they tend to come up with what I would describe as very extreme examples of that.
In your review of the transcript in this case, did you see any examples of comparisons to extreme figures based on the diagnosis of ASPD?
Well, I mean, during the closing arguments, there was information presented talking about Charles Manson as another person who had antisocial personality disorder. So there seemed to be a pretty direct parallel being drawn in relation to people who have antisocial personality disorder.
And so, based on your review of Dr. Angela's testimony, did he describe a reliable process for reaching a diagnosis of ASPD?
I would say that there are significant limitations to the information that he was relying on to reach a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder.
Did he describe a process that, in your opinion, was at a significant risk of being affected by confirmation bias?
Objection lead.
Sustained.
Do you have any thoughts on Dr. Rambler's opinion as it relates to the potential for confirmation bias?
So in regards to the opinions provided, there are things that experts can do to try to minimize that sort of factor from creeping into the process. You can rely on structured diagnostic interviews. That obviously didn't happen in terms of assessing the presence of characteristics. Basically, the more structured and constrained the method is that is being used to try to measure some psychological characteristic or diagnosis, the less likely that various types of bias are going to creep into that process.
And did it seem like Dr. Randula so constrained himself?
I would say no to that, just based on the totality of what he described as the basis of his opinion.
All right, so I want to talk to you about Dr. Rambo's opinion regarding future dangerousness. Do you have an opinion on the testimony regarding future dangerousness from Dr. Rambo?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
Sorry. I believe that when one considers what are well-established methodologies that one could use to engage in a violence risk assessment, that the approach that Dr. Arambula employed in this case fell short of the sorts of things that have been demonstrated to have some scientific reliability and validity, and that the method that he employed ultimately was relying on idiosyncratic risk factors that are largely not informative about whether somebody will engage in violent behavior in the future. That is, in essence, the current concern that I have is the methodology that was used and the potential for erroneous conclusions to be drawn.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What did it appear Dr. Arambula did rely on in forming his opinion about future dangerousness?
Right. So, I mean, at the outset of his testimony, Dr. Arambula described the characteristics that would be involved in a risk assessment, or the risk factors that might be relevant, and the methodology that he would go through. And the factors that ultimately were identified, I believe it's fair to say that at the end of his testimony, he was basically arguing that the presence of ASPD, as well as a clinical inference that Mr. McKane has a criminal thinking mindset in regards to hostility towards law enforcement, that make him especially likely to be violent in a prison setting towards guards, that those are not risk factors that the literature actually bears out as being the sorts of things that you would look at to try to make some estimate of whether somebody is going to engage in future violence in prison.
All right, so let's talk first about reliance on ASPD, okay? Do you have concerns regarding relying on a diagnosis of ASPD in order to inform a prediction about future dangerousness?
Yes.
What are your concerns with that?
Right, so again, there is research published looking at whether a diagnosis of specifically antisocial personality disorder gives you any probatively useful information about whether somebody will engage in significant violent behavior in a prison setting. There's a few studies that have looked at that, and there's none that have been published that suggest that that diagnosis is useful for trying to figure out who will be violent in a prison setting in the future. It is different from talking about the potential for violence in the community, where that's an entirely different type of context.
Is there research that describes whether or not the robustness of ASPD symptoms relate to future dangerousness?
So in the study that we did, we not only looked at whether the diagnosis was present or not, we also looked at the number of symptoms that the person was diagnosed as having, and that was unrelated to whether or not they would engage in a violent act. So the robustness of it, if you want to talk about robustness as how many of these symptoms does this person seem to exhibit, then no, that didn't matter in relation to their likelihood of engaging in violent behavior.
And yeah, so you referenced a study that your lab did. Could you elaborate more about what that study was?
Well, so we had, it was part of a larger grant where we were conducting research on both antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. And it was a very large project. We were collecting data across 8 states. And what we did was we were evaluating individuals coming into prisons as well as individuals who were transitioning out of prison as well. For those who were coming in, they were assessed for DSM, antisocial personality disorder, as part of this process. And the outcome measure was we were collecting their disciplinary infraction records over the subsequent year to look at how they were behaving during that time period in terms of getting written up for things. And we basically found no association between the diagnosis and any future aggressive actions that were part of their prison record. And it was a fairly large scale study, over 300 individuals that were followed across this. So,
And why did this study focus on individuals for a year?
Partly it was just the pragmatics of the funding we had for the project. We had to pay research assistants to go in and collect this information. And so in an ideal world, we would have loved to have followed them for longer periods of time. In the context of more pragmatically in relation to what does that mean about making these sorts of claims about antisocial personality disorder, there is pretty good research suggesting that if people are going to act out aggressively in prison settings, that they tend to do it relatively early on in their period of incarceration. I mean, that's not 100% true that after a year nobody engages in violence. I'm not saying that, but if somebody is likely to act out violently within the first year and certainly within the first couple of years, that's a fairly common thing that you would see it during that time period.
Are there scientifically based criteria on which to assess future dangerousness?
Well, there are known risk factors for violent behavior in institutional settings and specifically in prison settings. So yes, there is quite a bit of research that has looked at what are the features or characteristics of individuals who may be more likely to engage in violent behavior while they're incarcerated.
In your review of Dr. Rangerl's testimony, did he rely on those research-based criteria in forming his opinion?
He did not, from my read of what he listed as risk factors.
Are there misconceptions about what can be predictive of future dangerousness?
Yes, there's there is there are a lot of things that people might assume suggest that somebody will, if they go off to prison, of course they will be likely to be violent. That when people have actually investigated those and done follow-up studies, are actually not informative about whether somebody might engage in violent acts in the future.
Is the severity of a singular crime predictive of future dangerousness?
Well, several studies have looked at the issue of severity in relation to does that indicate that somebody is therefore more likely than say the typical or standard inmate to engage in violent behavior, and that generally has not been borne out. That the pre-conviction violent act, the severity of it in terms of what they are convicted of, has a lot of bearing on whether or not that person in prison for whatever sentence they're serving out is likely to be engaging in violent behavior.
And perhaps related to that, are you aware of any research-based reasons to review an autopsy as part of conducting an assessment for future dangerousness?
I mean, I'm not I'm not a medical doctor, so I would never have a reason to look at an autopsy in the context of knowing something about an autopsy to tell you that somebody looking at that is more or less likely to be violent in the future. I'm not aware of any research that has backed that sort of thing up. And in general, research looking at the severity or potential extremity of the crime that led to the conviction doesn't bear strongly on whether somebody's going to be violent or not.
Do you recall Dr. Arambula discussing what he referred to as dynamic risk factors in his discussion of future dangerousness?
Yes.
Could you explain what dynamic risk factors are?
Sure. So dynamic risk factors are things that are relevant to trying to make a prediction or reach an opinion about whether somebody may or may not be violent, that are essentially changeable or subject to some type of intervention. The field of risk assessment has historically focused a lot on what we refer to as static risk factors that are unchanging and are oftentimes largely irrelevant to managing someone. Like you were just hypothetically someone who was first arrested at 17, that never changes. You're not going to treat somebody for that in a prison setting to try to lower their risk or something like that. There's nothing you can really do with that. It's relevant to making, developing an opinion about future violence potentially. But because of a desire for the field to also be able to address the issue of risk management, in a lot of instances, mental health professionals are asked not only to offer an opinion about the potential for violence, but in a lot of settings, such as hospitals or prisons, we're frequently asked, well, what can we do about this to try to minimize it? And so the dynamic risk factors are things that you have some opportunity to potentially change that would impact potentially and from a risk reduction sort of perspective. So that's something that the field's been very interested in for the last several years, decades really.
And based on your review of Dr. Arambula's testimony, is his discussion of dynamic risk factors supported by research?
I did not see an assessment of dynamic risk factors. I saw an assessment that basically came to the conclusion of antisocial personality disorder, which was described as a stable characteristic that would not change over time. So there's nothing dynamic that's being described in that context. And the other factor was this discussion of thought processes and inferences about Mr. McKane's thinking patterns related to hating law enforcement and wanting to cause harm to law enforcement as the other big factor tying into that opinion about future dangerousness. And none of that was described as a dynamic thing that might change or be different. So dynamic risk factors are things like, where is somebody going to be housed if they are released from incarceration? That's something that can change. Are they going to be around criminal associates in the future? That's something that potentially can be changed over time. Are there medications that somebody might take that would reduce their impulsivity or something like that? Those are things that are changeable, but I didn't see those things being addressed in Dr. Arambula's testimony when he was talking about dynamic risk.
Are you aware of any research that supports interpreting thought processes surrounding suspected hatred of law enforcement as a method of predicting future dangerousness?
I am not. Well, let me clarify. I am not, and I am also. Dr. Arambula's conclusion specifically said that that was tied to heightened likelihood of specifically going after prison guards, and I'm not aware of any general research supporting that claim, especially in the absence of an interview, and the much more narrow prediction that guards will be the target of future violent behavior is definitely way out on a far limb in terms of any scientific support.
Were there times that Dr. Arambula stated to the jury that he was basing his opinions on research?
Yes.
In spite of that, are you aware of any research that supports the opinions he was giving?
Well, so for some of the risk factors that he talked about in general, he was talking about some things that are relevant potentially if someone is living in the community. So antisocial personality disorder has some modest association with the potential for future violent acts. If you're talking about somebody living in the free world, my understanding of Texas law is that a life sentence is a life sentence, and somebody convicted of a capital crime in given life will serve out the rest of their life in prison, barring being exonerated or something like that. So when you're talking about what somebody is likely to do, you have to consider the context in which that person is going to reside. And context is a dynamic risk factor, and to the extent that there's any control over where somebody goes. But there was no consideration of that. So I don't want to say that all of the research that Dr. Arambula made passing reference to is irrelevant to violence, but when you're talking about violence in a prison setting, the things that he was highlighting do not have strong scientific support to back up those claims.
And so just to orient you, I want to refer directly to a statement made by Dr. Arambula. I'm reading this from page 90 of volume 54 of the reporter's record. The statement is, "What I'm saying is the factors that I talked about are there because of research findings. I might add that research findings like this originate using statistics, and typically the thresholds are 5% chance that a finding is wrong, and at the worst, 10% chance that the finding is wrong, because they use p-values of 0.05 and 0.1. Are you able to comment on whether or not that statement is based in research?
P-values are used in...
I don't object to non-responsive.
You can answer the question, and then he can ask you a follow-up.
Could you restate the question? I'm sorry, I thought it was answered.
So
It was a yes or no question.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay.
is it, was that statement based in research that you're aware of?
It is not supported by research in terms of what I believe it was intended to convey, although I'm really not sure, honestly, what was being conveyed there.
What, in your opinion, what does that convey?
Object to relevance.
Because I think it's a probative as to the prejudice to the jury if he's ultimately misstating accuracy of his findings regarding future dangerousness and implying that they're 90 to 95% accurate. That's a significant statement, and it's highly relevant to the both the impropriety and the impact of Dr. Arambula's testimony.
That might be the case, Your Honor, but that wasn't the question, and that would have been a leading question.
All right, so your prior question was, although I'm not really sure what was being conveyed there, that was the answer. Then your question is, what does that convey? Can you rephrase that to make it more clear what you're asking for?
So, I guess Dr. Edens, do you have concerns about the manner in which Dr. Arambula communicated that statement to the jury?
Yes.
What are your concerns?
That it was confusing to me, and I run statistics all the time on the sorts of research that he's talking about, and I didn't understand what he meant there. So I believe it's fair to extrapolate from that somebody with a PhD involving the use of statistics, if I didn't understand it, that it would be at least confusing to the jury in terms of what the conclusions were that were being drawn there.
And to be clear, are you aware of any research that indicates that future dangerousness can be predicted with an accuracy of 90 to 95%?
No, not at all.
What does the research indicate about the accuracy of predicting future dangerousness?
Your Honor, at this point, can I take the witness on board diary briefly?
Yes.
Thank you. In response to that question, what research did you depend on to that he's referencing?
In relation to what Dr. Arambula testified to?
Correct. He asked you if there was any known research, and you said no. Can you tell me what research you've looked at to make that?
Oh, yes. So the studies that have looked at the accuracy of those types of claims that we can predict who will engage in violent behavior in the future in the context of capital cases, there's been about 4 studies that have looked at that. I published a study several years back looking at when experts are brought into court who testify that somebody is a future danger to society and they receive a death sentence. We followed up and looked at their post-conviction behavior in regards to whether they were written up for disciplinary infractions or were prosecuted by the SPU within the Texas prison system, and found that of 155 cases that we followed, there were 8 of those individuals over an extended follow-up period had engaged in some sort of violent act while that the prison system classified as something severe enough that it required more than basic first aid. So that was one example of some of the research that's looked at outcomes in relation to that. There's a few others that have been published as well by some researchers in the field.
Can you tell us what those are?
Sure. They're actually listed in the declaration that I wrote. I didn't print out copies. There are publications by various combination of authors. John Sorensen, I believe it's Soranson, Mark Cunningham, and Thomas Reedy, Reidy.
Thank you. Further question?
Go.
So again, just to clarify, are you aware of any research that indicates that future dangerousness can be predicted with 90 to 95% accuracy?
The research that has looked at those types of outcomes has never suggested that those types of predictions reach anything remotely close to that level of accuracy.
What does the research indicate those predictions reach in terms of accuracy?
Yeah, it depends on the individual study. So in the study I was just referencing, the future violent acts that we were documenting in relation to people who were labeled as a future danger to society and convicted and put on death row. Again, 8 out of 155 of those individuals over about a 14-year average follow-up period had engaged in some sort of violent act that the prison system identified as violent beyond needing simple first aid. And we collected other outcome measures as well in terms of most of those individuals had some sort of infraction in their file, but the vast majority of those infractions were not things that I think any reasonable person would label as being a violent act. It's things like having too many t-shirts in your cell or having, engaging in problematic behavior, but not behavior that was classified as violent.
Are you aware of any studies that well, I'll withdraw that question. So do you recall Dr. Ambula testifying that the method he's applying is not idiosyncratic?
I don't know that he used the word idiosyncratic. I don't recall seeing that. I recall him saying that his opinions were based on research findings and applying those research findings to reach his opinion about future dangerousness.
Could you comment on the methodology through which Dr. Rambula applied his clinical judgment?
Yes. So risk assessments historically have been done one of three ways, and the approach that Dr. Rambula took is one that has been investigated quite a bit, and that involves basically, from what I saw of how he described what he was doing, considering certain aspects of Mr. McKane that he identified as being significant risk factors for future prison violence, specifically directed again at guards, and combining that information based on what he referred to as a forensic analysis to reach a conclusion that because of having ASPD and having this negative belief system about law enforcement, that he was highly likely to engage in violent behavior in the future while incarcerated and serving out a life sentence. And I would describe the approach that he took as being idiosyncratic in terms of the methodology that he employed to reach that conclusion.
Do you have concerns about reliance on an idiosyncratic methodology?
Well, yes. I mean, research that's
Objection, narrative, and non-responsive. Sorry, Judge, non-responsive.
All right, so you can, that was a yes/no question, and then you can follow up.
Sorry.
Do you have concerns about relying on idiosyncratic methodology and coming to conclusions about future dangerousness?
Yes.
What are those concerns?
Well, this is an approach that's been investigated, and not just in capital murder trials, but violence risk in general, in hospital settings where decisions are being made about whether someone needs to be civilly committed, across broad areas. And the more that individuals rely on unstructured, impressionistic, inferential logic to combine sources of information to reach a determination that somebody will or won't be violent in the future, the more likely it is that they, one, tend to be wrong, and not just wrong like in either direction. They tend to be wrong in terms of over-predicting the likelihood that somebody will be violent in the future. So that's the main concern that I have about that unstructured clinical judgment approach relative to other approaches that have been that have been widely researched and have shown evidence of being much more effective, which I will happily describe if.
Yeah, are you able to describe the difference between unstructured and structured clinical judgment?
Yes. So, I mean, there is some nuance to this, but the issues discussed earlier about poor inter-rater reliability, I think I said earlier that that's not an issue simply about diagnostic reliability. It's about any opinion or prediction that somebody is attempting to engage in. And the thing that we know that has been borne out by research that's been done specifically in relation to violence risk is that if you use a structured methodology that has a standardized process by which you go through and consider scientifically based risk factors that provide a methodology for assimilating that information into an outcome opinion that is directly tied to the scientific research, then those types of estimates of whether somebody is going to be violent in the future or not tend to be much more stable and much more accurate in terms of essentially minimizing the amount of clinical judgment that goes into that process.
Are you aware of research discussing whether specifically hatred of law enforcement relates to future dangerousness?
I'm not.
And so are you aware of any research that would support asserting that hatred of law enforcement relates to future dangerousness?
I'm not, when we're talking about future dangerousness in relation to particularly prison-based violence directed towards guards. And more generally than that, I have not seen that as something that has been borne out as a strong risk factor for somebody to be violent in the future, just in general.
Are you aware of research on how periods of good behavior in institutional settings can impact someone's likelihood of being a future danger?
Yeah, stable prison adjustment is generally something that is a bellwether for continued stable prison adjustment without further disciplinary actions. Those periods also can, at least, give people, if somebody is essentially reclassified based on good behavior as a lower risk, then they're also given more freedoms and latitudes to engage in violent and aggressive behavior. So if somebody has those periods and they do act out, then those again, that's kind of a dynamic risk factor at some level in relation to the potential for somebody to their classification status to be modified over time.
Just a moment.
All right, let's just go ahead and break. It's 12:45, so it's a good time to get lunch. Let's just make it an hour 15. Be back by 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Judge.
How do you get out of my professor role?
Oh, I hear you.
Ask me that.
I do the same thing. I've been teaching about and not exclusive.
Yeah.
Make sure everything's clear because you can have so many stories in your head,
Yeah.
so many examples. It's so nice because you learn over time. Right? That's people learn.
Oh yeah.
They learn by this is this issue, and this is how you.